Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. But America's agriculture landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertising campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food to the store where you buy the final product and everything in between. This is Real Ag.
Soybeans are an annual legume, which is known nationally as the most important bean in the world. It provides vegetable protein for millions of people, as well as ingredients for hundreds of chemical products. We will take a look at soybeans on this episode of Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Soybeans have been a staple crop for Kansas farmers for years, and they are growing in popularity. Advances in the breeding of the crop to create more drought, pest, weed, and disease-resistant soybeans have allowed them to be planted in areas further west of where they have been traditionally grown. So, what are the benefits of growing soybeans in Kansas?
So soybeans are a popular crop across the U.S., but Kansas has seen a growing interest in soybean production across the state. You look in the past several years, soybean production as well as yields have increased across the state in Kansas. And the popularity of soybeans, I believe, is because soybeans is such a versatile crop to begin with. It has a large market with a lot of uses for soybean production, and so as farmers, that is something we're looking for. But also, having readily available markets and the demand there with soybean breeding has improved the genetics of soybeans over the years, allowing them to be planted further west in drier conditions or different conditions across the state that you see. That has helped with the expansion of soybeans across our state.
Soybeans have historically been a crop that you didn't see grown much in the western third of the state. There wasn't really an outlet for them, a soybean crush type facility. They are used in a monogastric animal diet, so poultry and pork production would use soybean meal as a component in their ration. Not as much of those sorts of facilities in western Kansas, so there just wasn't many soybeans grown. A couple of things have begun to change though. One is the development of soybean hybrids that had a shorter season of productivity, shorter amount of time from the date it was planted to the date that it was mature, that opened up a window for double cropping principally in that central third of the state of Kansas. So here would be the typical production year. In the fall, September, late August, September, a wheat crop is seeded. That wheat crop grows up until it gets dormant in the wintertime. By spring, it starts to green back up, and we're going to harvest that late May, June, maybe the very beginning of July like this year. Immediately following the harvest of wheat, those farmers are coming in and planting a soybean crop. And that soybean crop has just enough season by say October or the fall of that year to mature, because it's a little shorter season soybean plant. Then that ground lays fallow typically over the winter, and there may be a spring crop planted into it, or they may hold it again until fall and start the cycle again with a wheat crop. So it's given some double cropping opportunities that we haven't always had. Growing more soybeans in central and western Kansas allows us to begin to establish more poultry and swine operations. We just don't have many right now, but I think that could change. I think it's on the horizon. Certainly our focus right now is on feedlots and dairies and those ruminant animals. Soybeans don't have as much of a place there, but I think there's a future there for soybeans.
The soybeans are really taking off more and more to the eastern part of the state. Again, it goes back to the farming practices. This year's gonna be a tough year because a lot of times we've seen a lot of double crop soybeans, and double crop basically refers to farmers will put soybeans behind the wheat stubble, so they'll harvest the wheat and then they'll go back into a no-till situation and put soybean into the wheat stubble with hoping that they'll catch some blessing from Mother Nature and get some some rain, and then a good August weather where we get some moisture, which the rains this summer have definitely been nothing but spotty. We keep seeing the increase of double crop acres go in. Conventional farm soybean acres, they're fighting for acres from corn. And then this last year with the price of grain sorghum, we lost some probably acres of conventional soybeans to grain sorghum also.
Soybeans in our state of Kansas have increased over the last 15 or 20 years, and some of that is due to plant breeding, and some of it's due to just more experience with farmers and the ability also to double crop. In the south central part of the state, there's a lot of double cropping that goes on behind wheat, and soybeans have probably displaced a lot of milo or sorghum that used to be maybe the more predominant double crop. Soybean plant is getting more well established with the farmers in the area. That double cropping has really picked up a lot of acres as well.
So I think soybeans are a really good addition to the crop mix. They're really versatile in terms of when we can plant date. We have a lot more forgiveness on if we get a wet May and we need to push our plantings back. We can change our relative maturity of those soybeans and still be fine. It helps with spraying out our harvest load. I think putting a legume in there instead of a grass really benefits the soil, and we are able to use some different herbicides in soybeans that you can't use in corn or sorghum, so we're mixing up our herbicides that are our crop protection products that are applied to our fields to create some more diversity to help manage weeds.
We like to grow soybeans because it makes it easier and cheaper to grow irrigated corn. We don't have to apply all the technology for rootworm. We use less fertilizer because the soybeans, they fix nitrogen, so we're able to grow irrigated corn with less costs.
It penetrates the canopy of the cover really well. Soybean prices have been real well, works well with covers. I'm able to drill it, same with grain sorghum, with milo, soybean, and wheat. I'm able to use one piece of equipment, my air seeder, to drill all three crops.
Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits to growing soybeans. You know, one of the largest ones for us is it's an additional add into our crop rotation. So, you know, back in the 70s when my father-in-law was farming, it was primarily wheat and milo, and that would be the rotation if there was a rotation. Soybeans were added into the mix, and soybeans have maintained part of that rotation, which gives us a little more options in land management and what we're wanting to harvest and when.
So soybeans are a totally different plant family from corn or wheat, and they're in the legume family, which means that they have the ability to form these beneficial relationships with these bacteria that live in the soil and can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And so nitrogen is, of course, a really important fertilizer for plants, including corn and soybean. And so having soybean in a rotation is helpful for sort of restoring the fertility of the soil in between grain crops.
Soybeans are an excellent rotation crop. Soybeans are a broadleaf. A lot of our other crops like wheat, milo, corn are grass crops. It's nice to have that difference, broadleaf versus grass crops, for just weed control, getting control of grassy weeds. And soybeans is a legume, which means that it has the ability to fix its own nitrogen. It has a high C to N ratio, and that just means that it breaks down quickly in the soil, allowing available nitrogen for that next crop coming along that you use. Also in Kansas, soybean is used a lot as a double crop, in a double crop system. Our part of the state, there's a lot of wheat grown. What we see a lot here is soybeans planted after wheat is harvested, late June, even into early July. And then you get also, besides your wheat crop for that year, you can harvest soybeans that fall. So soybeans works great in a lot of cropping rotation systems across the state. Soybeans are generally grown as cash crop for the state, but again, the legume side of it, there's several cover crops that use cover crop mixtures that have legumes as a part of them. Soybeans are just great as far as nitrogen for your next crop. So yeah, they could be used for a cover crop, but usually they're not. Usually cover crops are planted in the summertime, so after a lot of cover crops go in after wheat is harvested, about the same time as you could plant your double crop soybeans. You could look at it that way as, yeah, it's acting as a cover, that double crop soybean, but then you're also using that as a cash crop and harvesting it in the fall. So the nice thing about soybeans is that they don't require a lot of inputs. They're nutrient-wise. They are high users of nutrients, so it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but it's because they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria on their roots. These are bacteria that have a symbiotic relationship with the soybean roots, and they actually take nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. So soybeans are actually making their own nitrogen with that symbiotic relationship. So they are high users of nitrogen, but again, you don't have to apply much, if any, nitrogen on your crop due to that relationship. Soybeans, in comparison to the other crops seen in Kansas, do use more phosphorus and potassium than some of the other crops. A lot of times, Kansas soils will have those nutrients already available in the soil and don't need to add additional, but it's always encouraged to take soil samples, really know what's in your soil, so that if you do need to apply any phosphorus or potassium for the high use that soybeans require, you don't want any nutrient limiting, to affect your soybean crop.
Corn depletes your soil. When you grow corn, you can go about 4 or 5 years, maybe 4 years in a row, and it's because it's a heavy feeder, because it needs a lot of nutrients, it's so productive, it will deplete your soil if you don't rotate it with something else. So most people throughout the Midwest, the Corn Belt, most producers will rotate corn with soybeans. The benefit of using soybeans in your rotation is that they have bacteria associated with their roots that fix nitrogen. So you can replenish some of the nitrogen that was lost from the soil, from the corn production, by producing soybeans. And then on top of that, because the soybeans are able to fix their own nitrogen, basically the fertilizer application in those years is less.
Soybeans fit in very well also with a corn rotation. They're a nitrogen fixer as a legume, and they also have the potential to carry high profit potential. They are an indeterminate crop, so they are adaptable depending on growing season conditions, whereas corn is a very regimented growth stage crop. If the corn stresses certain times of the season, it's going to have an impact on final yields in some way, and when you get later in the season, much of the fate of your production is determined up to that point. Soybeans, a lot of their yield is determined very late in the year. So long as the plant hasn't died or suffered dramatically from in-season stresses, it can come on late if conditions improve.
So soybeans are surprisingly drought tolerant, and that's something that has improved over the years with better genetics from plant breeding, but it really depends on the seasons. Of course, when you're starting out, you want good soil moisture to get those soybeans up and growing evenly and get a good start that way. And then they can really handle a lot of moisture stress early on in the growing season. So once they start flowering and towards the end of flowering, and when they start to set those seed pods, they're setting their soybeans, that's when their water use increases or ramps up. So, that would be a critical time to get those rains. And in Kansas, that's kind of an issue for us sometimes in the summers if you're not under an irrigation system and relying on Mother Nature to provide the rainfall for us. A lot of times that lands around August when it's hot and dry, so it's when we say we have saving August rains, we really mean it, because that's when the soybeans are taking up a lot of moisture, filling those pods, making that harvest that we're looking forward to in the fall. So overall, I think they estimate, it changes across the state where you have more humidity in the eastern side, drier in the western side of the state. That will change on how much water that soybeans need, but I think they estimate around 22 inches is what a soybean plant needs for water, and that will increase into the reproductive stages of the plant and then decrease on out as they mature and get ready for harvest.
Soybean crop typically doesn't take any nitrogen due to the fact that it's a legume plant, fixes its own nitrogen. They do take some phosphorus and some potassium, but most of that goes back into the soil. When the crop is done, it's in the stalk, it's not so much in the grain. And so therefore, typically only small amounts are needed because most of our soils have a pretty good bank of those nutrients already. Soybean inputs are are typically not a lot compared to other crops. It's mostly looking in terms of fertilizers or nutrients that you have to apply. The other inputs are really limited more or less to the seed. Other inputs for the soybeans are just weed control chemicals, and then sometimes we have some insect pressure that we have to also spray for or combat with some method.
Growing soybeans can be beneficial to your fields. Soil and the uses in crop rotation are some of the benefits of growing them. They can also be beneficial to the farmer's pocketbook. Soybeans are in demand around the globe with their many uses. So what are some of these uses for soybeans?
Some of the main uses, you have a crushed soybean meal or soybean oils are the two big products that come from soybean. Soybean meal goes a lot into feed, hog feed, chicken feed. A new venue is actually going into fish feed now, is a new market for soybeans and many other products. But soybean oil is also a big one. Soybean is an oil seed. High oil content in soybeans, and so if you go to your grocery store and see vegetable oil on the shelves, that is going to be soybean oil. Also, soybean oil is used in plastics and some tires. It can be used in place of a lot of petroleum products, so it's a more sustainable product using that oil from soybeans for a lot of those plastics and that sort of thing. So a lot of uses of soybeans, crayons, other things that your day-to-day use that you'll see has soybean oil as a part of it as well.
China uses a lot of soybeans in feed for hogs and other animals, but they also use a large amount of soybeans for their human consumption. Soybean product has a fair amount of protein in it for a grain crop, and so China and all of the dense population in China, rather than eating, say, beef or some other meat product for their protein, they've tended to lean more onto the soybean product that is cheaper and apparently more available for them. Other uses outside of feed or for human food, one predominant one I will say is soy oil, which can be turned into biodiesel. Biodiesel is a potentially large market. Of course, isn't constant back and forth with the petroleum diesel market. They kind of go hand in hand. Other products though could be anywhere from the foam in your car seat to some of the shielding used on some of the machinery. Plastic shields have a soy oil base to them. It's used in a lot of plastics, so that's the shielding again. Essentially, about anywhere that there is an oil-based product, usually the soybean oil can be either replace the oil or substitute at least some of it.
It's another feed additive, great for protein. It's being utilized in backgrounding yards. Soybean meal, it's another great plant-based protein. It goes into a lot of different areas outside of agriculture.
As with most crops, timing for growing soybeans is an important aspect of growing them in Kansas. So what is the season for soybeans?
So soybean planting usually starts in May. You want the soils fairly warm when you're planting soybeans. A risk of planting too early is to get cold and wet soils. You can get a lot of seedling diseases. That seed is not germinating quickly and sits in the soil and can cause a lot of problems. So we usually try to wait until May, but at the same time, we want to have as long of growing season as we can. So we've been pushing those dates earlier. I would say probably the first week of May is the earliest you plant soybeans. It's clear through June, and if you're double cropping, those guys will be planting soybeans even into the beginning of July. But most of the bulk of the soybeans, I would say, in Kansas are planted mid-May to early June timeframe. And then harvest would be into September into October.
We usually are planting soybeans anywhere from early May all the way through early July. You can plant what we call a full season soybean, which just means that it's not planted after the wheat crop is harvested. That's typically done in May, maybe parts of June. And then the double crop soybeans are typically planted in mid to late June, sometimes even July after the wheat is harvested. And essentially the plants will grow throughout the summer and early fall, and harvest typically is anywhere from late September through the month of October and can even stretch into November. So this time of year, there's still a few soybeans in the field right now. So occasionally we get into the mid-late November period.
The benefits to the soil, the usefulness in crop rotation, and their demand around the world are some of the many benefits to growing soybeans. But even the most versatile crops have drawbacks to their production. So what are the disadvantages of growing soybeans in Kansas?
So there are disadvantages of growing soybeans or ways that you have to manage the crop. Like a wheat, that's a crop that you can just kind of grow, multiple years and manage it. And what we've found on soybeans, you can't do that. Soybeans really benefit from crop rotation. One, because there are herbicide-resistant weeds that get into soybeans that are pretty tough to manage, but also you can get some soil diseases and pathogens that kind of seem to build up on year after year soybeans. If you grow it continuously, your yield will just kind of decline. So it's not really a negative, but it's something that you have to manage.
Probably the biggest disadvantage to soybeans in our area is you leave the ground very, very barren after harvest. You cut them off right flush with the ground, and typically in a dryland situation, there's not a lot of residue left, and you're subject to wind erosion during the winter. That's probably the biggest disadvantage to a bean in western Kansas.
For us, especially on our farm, which is both dry land and irrigated acres, if you take a look at the dry land soybeans versus the irrigated acres, disadvantage would definitely be the time commitment required, especially on the irrigated side. Here in central Kansas in the summer, when the wind and the sun are just beating down on those crops day in and day out in the summertime, as a dryland farmer, you just kind of watch the crop and pray for rain. But on our irrigated acres, we're really working hard to make sure that the water is running, whether it's subsurface drip or our pivots or our flood irrigation, to making sure that those crops aren't just staying alive but are thriving during those environmental times.
When growing soybeans, we run dicamba soybeans or Liberty Link soybeans, and just for reference, Ingenia, which is a dicamba product, your last spray date is June 30th. Planting timing is important, making sure you comply with the dicamba restrictions can be a challenge, particularly in Kansas with the wind and inversion potential when spraying.
Is the weed control that we are fighting in soybeans these days. Soybean is a broadleaf plant, and most of our weeds are also broadleaves. We fortunately have some traits in the soybeans, some genetic traits that allow us to spray some certain chemicals that help us to control those weeds, but we also have some weed resistance that is starting to show up with certain varieties or certain types of weeds. So that is becoming one of the larger challenges, is really fighting the weeds with technology and different types of chemicals, different types of genes within the soybean plant, how we can control those weeds, still keep the healthy crop of soybean in the field.
You have to cut soybeans very low to the ground, which leaves very little standing stubble, and that is not a very, it's kind of antithesis to our no-till environment we're trying to build, where we keep our acres covered, for instance, with a good wheat stubble or even corn stalks.
Other issues with soybeans on a larger scale is our market structure for soybeans. We have a huge export market from this country. China's one of the big buyers of soybeans, some other countries around the world as well. We have really strong market for soybean, but right now we're also a little bit dependent upon the China market and a few other export markets to keep those markets working properly, keep them active without any political or other disruption. There's some risk involved with the soybean market that we could have a severe downturn if we have some disruptions in the global supply chain, global market trading structure.
I think the biggest challenge or negative of soybeans is managing resistant pigweeds in the crop. Used to be we planted soybeans to clean fields up, but before we had resistant weeds, we could go out there and use glyphosate and clean up fields really well. Since weeds have developed a little bit of resistance to glyphosate, it's become more of a challenge. And now in our current environment, we have products or we have traded beans that we can use to manage it. We have two different platforms. There's Extendiflex and then there's Enlist Beans. Both of their programs work well on their own. They don't always work well if you have differing platforms on neighboring fields, which is a challenge in terms of managing the resistant weeds that are out there, and also neighbor relations at times.
It's been getting tougher and tougher each year of keeping pigweeds out, or palmer amaranth. They're getting more and more resistant to dicamba as well as glyphosate. The way the laws were made for this year, we weren't able to spray the dicamba after June 30th. So there was a lot of escapes of palmer that had grown into the soybeans that we weren't able to spray and to terminate those. So weed pressure is probably the biggest challenge with soybeans. Growing these cover crops and adding organic matter, I've noticed that the soybeans have become more drought tolerant, and a lot of that has to do also with newer and better varieties.
So there's several diseases and insects that can cause some issues to soybeans. And that's really, you gotta be watching and scouting your beans. A few insects that can cause some problems is bean leaf beetle can feed on those pods some, and also soybean podworm. A lot of your leaf-eating insects, you got to get a pretty high a level of those insects in the field before they cause a lot of problems. But if they're eating on the soybean pod, that's something you got to be careful with. You lose a lot of yield quickly. Diseases, there's not too many in the state, and if you're in a wetter area of the state where you don't dry out, you might get some Pythium root rot, the seedling diseases that you might experience early in the cool, wet soils. Frog-eye leaf spot is one disease that you might see across the state. In our fields, we've had an issue with Decti stem borer. So they're actually a little beetle that lays its eggs in the base of the stem of the soybean plant, and the larvae hatch and just chew up the stem. I'm not sure the yield effects on that, but it can cause lodging, or the plant will fall over prematurely in the fall, causing harvest issues. And really those insects are so protected inside that stem there. You know, there's really no control measures at this point to control that insect. So, getting out there before they fall over in the fall and harvest is key for those sorts of issues. A big challenge for soybean growers is weed control. Pigweeds are probably the most challenging. They're a weed that sprouts really about the same time as the soil warms up, gets nice and warm, but produces millions upon millions of seeds, even one plant, and it will continue to spread those seeds and germinate all summer long. And so when we're trying to do our pest control management, weed control management plans, we're trying to get our fields clean for planting and then have a residual to try to control those weeds, because timing is so critical. We've got a lot of weed resistance now, so that those weeds breed amongst each other so fast, they produce so many seeds. They get resistance to the chemicals or the different control measures that we're using out there. And so it becomes a big challenge. You gotta get in there soon. You've gotta have a good mix of products that will control the different, resistance that we might find, especially on those pigweeds. And with Kansas, with our weather situation, and it might be muddy, it might whatever it is, or you might not get a rain after you apply the herbicide, which a lot of times you need a rain to activate that herbicide. So, we're kind of dealing with what we receive as far as rainfall and all of that to get a good weed management plan out there. Exports is a big part of soybeans. We have, I believe, almost half of our soybean production in the U.S. is exported, China being one of our biggest buyers of soybeans. And so Kansas being a landlocked state away from ports, that is one thing, just transportation to ports. That is kind of a negative, increased cost of transportation there. But yeah, soybeans is a great crop to grow, and not a lot of negatives. I think that's why we're seeing a lot more across the state.
With all their uses and the national market need for soybeans, as well as the ability to put nutrients back in the ground, soybeans can be incredibly profitable to the farmers who choose to grow it. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Real Ag on soybeans. As always, you can check out this and other episodes of Real Ag on SmokyHillsPBS.org. From the producers at Smoky Hills PBS, this has been Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from